For thousands of years, human societies believed their leaders were gods. By the end of this journey, you will understand why this belief shaped entire civilizations and still echoes today. What made a mere mortal worthy of worship, and why did these legends appear on every continent, from the sun kings of the Andes to the divine pharaohs of the Nile? From Mesopotamia to the Americas, rulers claimed or were believed to be divine, and those legends wove themselves into laws, rituals, and the very fabric of culture. We will explore 30 distinct stories arranged across time and place, revealing both common patterns and startling variations. But the truth behind these legends is as complex as the stories themselves, blurring the line between history, myth, and the raw mechanics of power. What comes to mind when you think of a leader who was also a god? One of the earliest legends comes from the city of Uruk. Gilgamesh was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, and his father was the mortal king Lugalbanda. That mixed heritage shaped everything about him. He was stronger, faster, and more ambitious than any ordinary human, yet he could still feel pain, fear, and loss. His divine blood drove him to build great walls and push his people to their limits, but it also left him restless, always searching for something more. The story of Gilgamesh is preserved on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, and it remains one of the oldest surviving works of literature. It centers on his friendship with Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to balance Gilgamesh's overwhelming power. At first they fought, then they became inseparable companions. Together they faced monsters and defied the gods themselves, yet their adventures came at a cost. When Enkidu fell ill and passed away, Gilgamesh was shattered. The loss forced him to confront a question his divine nature could not answer: why do even the mightiest die? He spent years searching for immortality. He crossed oceans and climbed mountains. He met a wise man who survived a great flood. He found a plant that could restore youth. But in the end, a serpent stole it while he slept. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk empty-handed, yet changed. He understood that his divine part was not meant to live forever, but to build something lasting for his people. The epic serves as an early meditation on the limits of divine power in human form. Gilgamesh could rule with wisdom, fight with superhuman strength, and command the respect of kings. But he could not escape mortality. His story became a mirror for later civilizations that would also wrestle with the same question: how can a divine ruler truly lead when even a god must someday rest? That question would echo across the sands of Egypt, where the answer took a very different shape. The answer took a very different form along the Nile. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely part divine like Gilgamesh. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god, and the son of Ra, the sun god himself. This was not a polite metaphor or a poetic title. It was the official state doctrine, written in stone, carved into temple walls, and chanted during coronation ceremonies. Every morning, the priests performed rituals to ensure the pharaoh's divine essence remained strong, because the entire cosmos depended on it. The central concept was Mat, the ancient Egyptian principle of order, balance, and truth. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Mat by defeating chaos, ensuring good harvests, and keeping the gods content. If the king stumbled, the whole world could tip into disorder. This responsibility turned every royal action into a sacred act, from building monuments to waging war. To reinforce this divine status, the pharaohs commissioned spectacular displays of power. They built colossal temples where they were shown in the company of gods, receiving life from deities or being suckled by goddesses like Hathor or Isis. That image of a goddess nursing the king was a powerful symbol. It said that even in infancy, the ruler was sustained by heaven itself. One of the most famous examples is Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years and somehow found time to erect more statues and inscriptions than any other pharaoh. He covered the walls of Abu Simbel with scenes of himself as a god among gods. In one famous relief, he is shown offering incense to his own divine image, a stunning act of self-worship. Official inscriptions called him the strong bull, beloved of Mat, and claimed that the god Ptah had crafted him with his own hands. Of course, there was a human side to all this grandeur. Ramesses lived through military defeats, health challenges, and the deaths of many of his children. His body, now preserved in a museum in Cairo, shows signs of arthritis and dental problems. He was a man who felt pain, yet his official story insisted he was a god. That tension between the divine mask and the human face is part of what makes Egyptian kingship so fascinating. The rituals helped bridge the gap. The most important was the Sed festival, a grand celebration held after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years. During the festival, the king would run a ritual race around a marked course to prove his physical fitness. He would then be crowned again, symbolically reborn as a younger, more powerful version of himself. The Sed festival was a public renewal of divine energy, reassuring everyone that the god-king still had the strength to maintain Mat. This practice influenced neighboring cultures in Nubia and beyond, and the belief that the ruler was a living god lasted for nearly 3,000 years. The last pharaohs to claim this status lived long after the pyramids were ancient, and the tradition only faded with the arrival of new empires and new ideas. But even then, the legacy of the divine ruler persisted, waiting to appear in other lands where kings would once again walk among their people as gods. Far to the east, another legend took root. In the Japanese archipelago, a figure named Jimmu is remembered as the first human emperor, but his origins were far from ordinary. According to the ancient chronicles known as the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, Jimmu was a direct descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess herself. That lineage placed him not merely as a ruler, but as a living bridge between the realm of the gods and the world of mortals. His story begins not on a throne, but on the island of Kyushu, where he gathered his followers and set out on a journey eastward toward the fertile Yamato region, the area that would become the heart of Japan. The journey was not a simple relocation. Along the way, Jimmu and his clan faced resistance from local chieftains and hostile tribes, but the chronicles describe divine interventions that guided him. A golden kite sent by the gods alighted on his bow and blinded his enemies with its radiant glow. At another critical moment, the sun itself seemed to halt its course to give his army an advantage. These signs were not mere ornaments in the story. They were proof that heaven had chosen Jimmu, that his quest was sacred, and that any opposition was defiance of the cosmic order. Eventually, he established his capital at Kashihara in what is now Nara Prefecture and became the first Tenno or heavenly sovereign. This foundation myth served a profound purpose. It established the idea of an unbroken imperial line stretching from Jimmu all the way to the modern era. No foreign dynasty ever replaced the Japanese imperial house, and this continuity became a cornerstone of national identity. The emperor was not just a political leader, he was a living god, a manifest kami whose very existence ensured harmony between heaven and earth. This concept persisted for centuries, with emperors performing rituals to sustain the land's fertility and protect the people from natural disasters. It only shifted in the 20th century when, after a devastating conflict, the emperor formally acknowledged a human role in a historic address. Yet the symbolic legacy remains deeply woven into the culture. Central to Jimmu's legitimacy were the three sacred treasures: the mirror, the sword, and the curved jewel. These objects, said to have been handed down from Amaterasu herself, represented wisdom, valor, and benevolence. They were not just regalia, they were the physical proof of divine lineage, kept in secret shrines and displayed only during coronations. The mirror, for instance, was believed to be the very one that lured the sun goddess from her cave, restoring light to the world. By possessing these treasures, each emperor renewed the covenant with heaven. Jimmu's story echoes similar themes found across East Asia. In China, emperors claimed the mandate of heaven, a divine approval that could be lost if a ruler became unjust. In Korea, the mythic founder Dangun was said to be the son of a heavenly prince and a bear transformed into a woman. Each legend adapted the idea of divine kingship to its own landscape, yet they all shared a core belief that the right to rule came from above and that the health of the kingdom depended on the ruler's connection to the gods. These narratives shaped laws, wars, and the daily lives of millions, long before the modern world began to question where authority truly comes from. On the Korean peninsula, a different kind of divine origin story emerged. The legend of Dangun Wangyeom begins not with a god simply choosing a human mother, but with an animal who earned the right to become human through a trial of endurance. According to the ancient text, the Samguk Yusa, the heavenly prince Hwanung asked his father, the Lord of Heaven, to let him rule a kingdom on earth. The Lord agreed, and Hwanung descended with 3,000 followers to a sacred spot beneath a sandalwood tree. He taught the people laws, agriculture, medicine, and the arts. Then a bear and a tiger came to him, begging to become human. Hwanung gave them a challenge: stay in a dark cave for 100 days, eating only garlic and mugwort, and you will be transformed. The tiger gave up after a short time, but the bear endured. After 100 days, the bear emerged as a beautiful woman. She was known as the Bear Woman, and she was grateful but lonely. She prayed for a child, and Hwanung heard her. He took her as his wife, and she gave birth to a son named Dangun. That son was part god, part human, and part bear. He grew up wise and powerful, and in the year 2333 before the Common Era, he founded the first Korean kingdom, Gojoseon. Dangun ruled for over 1,000 years according to the legend, and then at the end of his long reign, he did not die. He ascended a mountain and became a mountain god, the Sansin, a spirit who watches over the land to this day. This is not a simple birth story. The animal transformation element sets it apart from other divine origin myths. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh was part god and part mortal. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a god in human form. In Japan, Jimmu descended from the sun goddess. But here in Korea, the path to divinity passed through an animal's patience and suffering. The bear's trial represents a theme of endurance and sacrifice that resonates deeply in Korean culture. For centuries, the Dangun legend served as a foundation for national identity. It gave the early Korean states a claim to divine mandate, a sacred origin that placed them on equal footing with the great empires of China and Japan. The legend was revived during times of foreign pressure, used to unite the people under a shared ancestral story. Even today, the date of Gojoseon's founding is celebrated as a national holiday in North and South Korea. But the idea of a ruler born from a celestial parent and a creature of the earth is not unique to Korea. Across the Pacific, another civilization built its empire on a similar belief, though their divine ancestor came not from a cave but from the sun itself. In the high Andes of South America, another divine king emerged from the sun itself. The Inca people believed that their ruler, the Sapa Inca, was the direct son of Inti, the sun god. This was no mere symbolic title. It was the absolute foundation of their entire civilization, the empire they called Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. The Sapa Inca did not just govern. He was the living source of warmth, light, and life, the same force that made crops grow and rivers flow. Every subject in the empire, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, understood that obeying the Sapa Inca was the same as obeying the sun. To challenge him was to invite darkness and chaos. When a new Sapa Inca took the throne, the coronation rituals were designed to make this divine connection visible to everyone. The ceremony began with a pilgrimage to Coricancha, the temple of the sun in the capital city of Cusco. Coricancha was not just a temple. Its walls were covered in sheets of pure gold, and its courtyards were filled with life-sized statues of llamas, cornstalks, and even human figures, all made from precious metals. The sun's rays would hit these golden surfaces and fill the entire complex with a blinding, sacred glow. Inside the main sanctuary, the new ruler would kneel before the mummified remains of his ancestors. He would ask for their blessing and then receive a golden headdress known as the mascapacha. This headdress, a tassel of red wool fringed with gold threads, was the ultimate symbol of his authority. Once it was placed on his forehead, he was no longer a man. He was Inti's chosen son, reborn as the empire itself. The presence of those mummified ancestors was not a matter of simple respect. The Inca practiced a mummy cult that kept their past rulers physically present. The bodies of deceased Sapa Incas were carefully preserved, dressed in fine garments, seated on thrones, and brought out for important ceremonies. They were given food, drink, and even consulted on matters of state by specially appointed attendants. To the Inca, these mummies were still alive in a spiritual sense, holding authority and power. The current ruler did not rule alone. He ruled alongside a council of his divine predecessors. This tradition blurred the line between the living and the dead, creating a dynasty that stretched back to the very beginning of time. One of the most famous Sapa Incas to embody this divine claim was Pachacuti. His name means he who remakes the world, and he lived up to it. Before Pachacuti, the Inca were a relatively small kingdom in the Cusco Valley. But under his leadership, they transformed into a vast empire stretching from modern-day Ecuador to Chile. Pachacuti reinforced his divine status by rebuilding Cusco in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal, and by constructing the magnificent fortress of Sacsayhuaman with stones so perfectly fitted that a knife blade cannot slip between them. He also expanded Coricancha, covering it with more gold and dedicating it to Inti on a grander scale than ever before. Every conquest he made was presented as a holy mission, spreading the light of the sun to peoples who lived in darkness. His victories were not just military successes, they were proof that the sun god favored him and that any resistance was doomed. The daily role of the Sapa Inca was both economic and religious. He was the ultimate mediator between the gods and the people. The empire's vast agricultural wealth, from potatoes and maize to the wool of llamas and alpacas, was considered a gift from Inti. The Sapa Inca controlled its distribution, ensuring that storehouses were full and that no one starved, at least in theory. He also performed ritual fasts, sacrifices, and ceremonies to ensure the sun continued its journey across the sky. The most important festival was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, held during the winter solstice. On that day, the Sapa Inca would raise a golden goblet filled with chicha, a corn beer, and offer it to the sun. The crowd would chant and dance, and the ruler's divine connection was renewed for another year. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they quickly realized how powerful this belief was. They exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The Spanish understood that the Inca people would not easily resist a figure they believed was divine. So they captured the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, held him for ransom, and then executed him anyway. They used the Inca's own sacred hierarchy to control the population, installing puppet rulers who claimed the same divine lineage. The temples were stripped of gold, the mummies were destroyed, and the religious system was replaced with a new faith. But the memory of the Sapa Inca as the son of Inti never fully vanished. It lingered in the mountains, the festivals, and the whispered stories passed down through generations, a reminder that even the most powerful divine kingdoms can be broken by human ambition. One emperor took the dream of divine rule further than any before him. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a king of the state of Qin conquered all rival kingdoms and proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. His ambition was not merely to rule China. He wanted to erase the past and build something eternal with himself as its immortal heart. The Zhou dynasty that preceded him had developed the idea of the mandate of heaven, a moral contract between heaven and the ruler. If a king governed wisely and cared for his people, heaven granted him the right to rule. but if he became corrupt or weak, heaven would withdraw its favor and another dynasty would rise to replace him. This was a flexible philosophy that allowed for change, rebellion, and the rise of new houses. It assumed that divine favor could be earned and lost. Qin Shi Huang rejected that instability. He did not want a mandate that could be revoked. He wanted to be the mandate itself, a permanent god on earth. To accomplish this, he standardized writing, currency, weights, and measures across his vast new empire. He connected the defensive walls into what would later become the Great Wall. He ordered the burning of books that challenged his authority, burying scholars alive to silence dissenting voices. Every action was designed to show that his power was absolute and beyond question. He abandoned the old title of king and created a new one, Shi Huangdi, a word that blended the ancient terms for god and emperor. He performed the ancient Feng and Shan sacrifices on sacred mountains, rituals that only a ruler with heaven's blessing could conduct. These ceremonies were ancient and rare, and by performing them, he claimed a direct line of communication with the highest powers. To reinforce his divine status, he surrounded himself with omens and portents. When a meteor fell from the sky, his officials inscribed it with words proclaiming the first emperor's everlasting rule. He interpreted natural events as signs of heaven's approval, and he punished anyone who dared to suggest otherwise. But the most staggering testament to his divine ambition lies beneath the earth. Near his capital at Xianyang, he ordered the construction of a vast underground city. Over 700,000 laborers worked for decades to build a mausoleum that would mirror his earthly empire. The most famous part of this tomb is the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with a unique face, standing in battle formation to guard him in the afterlife. But there was more. The tomb itself, according to ancient historian Sima Qian, contained a ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the stars and rivers of mercury flowing like the Yangtze and the Yellow River. The first emperor planned to rule from beyond death. He sent expeditions to find the legendary islands of the immortals, seeking plants and elixirs that could grant eternal life. He hosted alchemists in his court who mixed potions of cinnabar and other minerals. Irony of ironies, some historians believe that one of those elixirs containing mercury actually contributed to his decline. When Qin Shi Huang died during a tour of his empire, his death was kept secret for weeks. His advisors wanted to prevent rebellion, so they filled his carriage with rotting fish to mask the smell of decay, a grim detail that reveals how fragile the god-king's power truly was. His dynasty collapsed only a few years after his passing. The Qin lasted just 15 years, but the legend of the first emperor endured, a cautionary tale about the loneliness and self-destruction of divine ambition. As his dynasty crumbled, another legend was already forming on the opposite side of the world, a story of a king who did not die but only slept, waiting to return in Britain's darkest hour. Arthur did not die but sleeps, waiting for Britain's call. That is the promise of the Arthurian legend, a story that transformed a shadowy historical figure into the ultimate symbol of divine kingship. Unlike Qin Shi Huang, who tried to force eternity through conquest and alchemy, Arthur's immortality came from faith, from a belief that a rightful ruler could never truly be lost. The legend begins not with the king himself, but with his father, Uther Pendragon. Uther fell in love with Igraine, the wife of a powerful duke. Desperate to be with her, he turned to the wizard Merlin, who used magic to change Uther's appearance into that of her husband. Under that deception, Arthur was conceived. It was not a clean or honorable beginning, but in the world of myth, it marked the child as extraordinary, touched by forces beyond ordinary human law. Merlin took the newborn Arthur away and raised him in secret, hidden from the chaos that followed Uther's death. When the time came for a new king, a strange sign appeared in the churchyard of London. A sword was driven into a stone, and upon the stone were engraved words, "Whoever pulls this sword from this stone is the rightful king of all Britain." Many tried and failed. Then the young Arthur, not yet knowing his own lineage, casually pulled the sword free during a tournament when his foster brother needed a weapon. That act, witnessed by the assembled nobles, proved his divine right. The sword in the stone was not a test of strength but of destiny. It declared that kingship came from heaven, not from birth or battle alone. Later, after Arthur broke that sword in a duel, he received a second blade from a mysterious source. The Lady of the Lake rose from the water, her arm clothed in white silk, and presented Excalibur, a weapon said to be forged on the Isle of Avalon. Its scabbard protected the wearer from bleeding. Excalibur was more than a sword. It was a symbol of the supernatural alliance that sustained Arthur's rule. At his side stood Merlin, the wise magician who guided him, warned him, and sometimes frustrated him with cryptic prophecies. Merlin represented the ancient wisdom of the Druids and the Celtic otherworld, a bridge between the old gods and the new Christian order that Arthur was meant to usher in. Together, these elements, the sword in the stone, Excalibur, the Lady of the Lake, and Merlin's counsel, created a reign that felt blessed by forces beyond human control. Arthur's court at Camelot became the ideal of justice and chivalry. He gathered knights who swore oaths to protect the weak and uphold honor. The Round Table was a deliberate break from the old feudal hierarchies, a place where all knights were equal before their king. Yet the purity of that vision was constantly tested. The ultimate test came in the form of the Holy Grail, the cup that caught Christ's blood during his final hours. The Grail was not a treasure to be seized. It was a sacred object that could only be seen by the pure of heart. The quest for the Grail sent Arthur's knights across the land, each facing their own spiritual trial. Most failed. Only the virtuous Sir Galahad, the purest of them all, achieved the vision and was taken up to heaven. The Grail quest exposed the limits of earthly kingship. Even a divinely chosen king could not command holiness. It had to be earned, and that lesson would echo through Arthur's final tragedy. His own queen, Guinevere, fell in love with his greatest knight, Lancelot. The betrayal split the court, leading to civil war. In the last battle, Arthur fought his own son Mordred, who had risen against him. Mortally wounded, Arthur was taken by a mysterious boat to the Isle of Avalon, beyond the mortal world. There he did not die. He sleeps along with his knights in a hidden cave beneath a hill or an enchanted island, waiting for the moment when Britain faces its greatest peril. This sleeping king motif is deeply Celtic. It appears in tales of Bran the Blessed and the mythical king of the Britons, a belief that a righteous ruler does not truly pass but remains in a twilight state, ready to return when his people need him. Over the centuries, the Arthur legend grew beyond story. It became a foundation for European monarchy. English kings from Henry II to Henry VIII claimed lineage from Arthur. The Tudor dynasty used his imagery to justify their rule. The symbol of the Round Table was revived in royal ceremonies. Arthur's code of chivalry influenced knights from the Crusades to the Age of Exploration. And the Holy Grail became a metaphor for any noble, unreachable goal. Today, Arthur remains the once and future king, a figure who transcends history and lives in the imagination. His story proves that a ruler's greatest power is not in his laws or armies, but in the hope he leaves behind. A different kind of divine messenger appeared among the warring nations of the northeast woodlands. He was not a king who slept in a cave waiting to return, but a peacemaker who carried a message from the Creator himself. His name was Daganowida, known to history as the Great Peacemaker, and his coming would transform the violence of 5 rival tribes into a lasting union that still exists today. But the Great Peacemaker could not speak freely, so he chose a spokesman, a man named Hiawatha, who had a voice like thunder and a spirit that could fly above the treetops. Together, they walked a path that would become the great law of peace, a constitution that the people believed was not written by human hands but revealed by the heavens. The story begins in a time of endless conflict. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations were locked in cycles of revenge and bloodshed. Villages burned, families mourned, and the earth drank the blood of warriors. It was into this chaos that the great peacemaker arrived, crossing Lake Ontario in a stone canoe, a detail that signaled his otherworldly nature. He carried no weapon, he carried only a message of peace and a plan for unity, but he had a speech impediment that made it hard for others to understand him. So he chose Hiawatha, a skilled orator who had lost his own daughters in the wars, to speak on his behalf. Hiawatha was not an ordinary man. Legends say he could fly through the air, using his powers to scout enemy positions and deliver messages across great distances. This supernatural ability marked him as more than a human helper. He was a bridge between the earthly struggle and the divine plan. The great peacemaker's message was simple yet radical: stop fighting, bury your weapons, and join together under a single law that would ensure peace for all future generations. He went from nation to nation offering the great law. Some leaders rejected him, including the powerful Onondaga chief Tadadaho, a man so twisted by cruelty that his hair writhed with snakes. Tadadaho was said to have a twisted body and a twisted mind, and he used sorcery to block the peace. But Hiawatha, with his flying ability and persuasive words, eventually convinced Tadadaho to join the Confederacy. The snakes were combed from his hair, a ritual cleansing that symbolized the transformation from tyrant to leader. Under a great tree, the 5 nations planted a white pine, its roots spreading in 4 directions, and beneath it they buried their weapons of war. The tree became the symbol of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. The great law of peace was not a mere agreement between men. It was considered a sacred constitution, a gift from the Creator himself. The laws governed everything from council meetings to the adoption of new members, and they were recited orally at gatherings, memorized with precise wording to ensure they remained unchanged. The leaders of the Confederacy, the 50 sachems or chiefs, were not considered divine in the way of pharaohs or emperors. Instead, they were seen as stewards of a divine order, caretakers of a peace that had been given from above. Their authority came from their ability to uphold the great law, and if they failed, they could be removed by the clan mothers, the women who held the real power to appoint and depose. This was a system that balanced spiritual authority with human accountability. It was unprecedented in its time and later influenced thinkers like Benjamin Franklin when the American colonies began to form their own union. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy endured for centuries through colonial wars, displacement, and cultural pressure. It still holds council fires today. The great peacemaker did not become a sleeping king or a god king on a throne. He simply vanished after his work was done, leaving behind only the memory of his message. Hiawatha, the flying speaker, became a name that echoed through stories, a reminder that peace sometimes requires both divine vision and human courage. And just as this legend spread across the woodlands, another kind of demigod was rising across the vast Pacific Ocean, where chiefs claimed descent from the gods themselves and walked the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, a demigod named Maui performed impossible feats. He was a trickster, a shapeshifter, and a chief whose adventures were sung across hundreds of islands from Hawaii to New Zealand to Samoa. Maui did not sit on a throne or build a capital. His kingship was proven through actions so bold that they reshaped the world itself. In one famous story, Maui went fishing with his brothers. Instead of bait, he used a magic fishhook made from the jawbone of his grandmother. He cast the line deep into the ocean and felt a tremendous weight. With all his strength, he pulled and pulled until a great landmass rose from the waves. That land became the North Island of New Zealand, known in Maori as Te Ika a Maui, the fish of Maui. Every mountain, every bay was part of that catch. The brothers, eager to claim their share, began cutting into the catch, which is why the island has such a rugged coastline. But Maui had not only fished up islands, he had claimed them for his people. That act of creation was also an act of rulership. It established his mana, the spiritual authority that comes from divine power and ancestral lineage. In Polynesian culture, mana is not something a person earns solely through effort. It is inherited, granted by the gods, and it must be protected and increased through great deeds. Maui continued to build his mana by tackling the sun itself. The days were too short for his people to complete their work, so Maui wove a strong rope from coconut fiber and hid at the edge of the pit where the sun rose each morning. When the sun appeared, he lassoed it and refused to let go until the sun promised to slow its journey across the sky. From that day, the days grew longer and the harvests more plentiful. This was not a selfish act of defiance. It was a chief's duty to ensure the well-being of his people. By controlling the sun, Maui demonstrated his ability to bend the forces of nature to serve his community. His third great feat involved stealing fire from the underworld. The goddess Mahuika, the keeper of fire, tried to discourage him by giving him dangerous flames. But Maui tricked her again and again until she finally surrendered the secret of how to create fire by rubbing sticks together. He brought that knowledge back to the human world, ensuring that warmth, light, and cooking would never be lost. In some versions of the story, he almost perished in the attempt, showing that his power came with risk and sacrifice. What makes Maui so fascinating is the ambiguity of his status. In some traditions, he is a demigod, the son of a mortal woman and a divine father. In others, he is a chief among men, elevated by his deeds and genealogy. That blurring reflects a core truth of Polynesian divine kingship. Rulers did not claim to be gods in the way Egyptian pharaohs did. Instead, they traced their lineage to gods, often through epic genealogies recited at ceremonies. A high chief was a living descendant of the great ancestors who had voyaged across the ocean, and those ancestors themselves were children of the Sky Father and Earth Mother. Maui straddled that line. He was both a character in myth and a model for actual chiefs. His stories taught that authority came from service, cleverness, and courage, not from birth alone. His mana was something he built through his deeds, even though his lineage already carried divine potential. This fluid boundary between humanity and divinity allowed Polynesian societies to honor their rulers while also expecting them to earn their place through leadership and generosity. The concept of the divine ruler was not a rigid doctrine but a living tradition that adapted to each island and each generation. Maui's legend spread across the vast Pacific, carried by navigators who sailed between islands using stars, currents, and birds. His tale changed slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same: a hero who fished up land, slowed the sun, and stole fire for the good of his people. His legacy is still celebrated today in festivals, tattoos, and carvings. And as Maui's stories traveled the waves, another foundation myth was taking shape on the shores of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of divine ancestry would give birth to an empire that still echoes in our laws and languages. Two brothers raised by a wolf became the foundation of the most powerful empire in Western history. The story begins with a Vestal virgin named Re Silvia, a priestess sworn to chastity, and the god Mars, who visited her in a sacred grove. From their union, twins were born. The king of the region, fearing these children would one day challenge his throne, ordered them thrown into the Tiber River. But the river did not take them. The basket carrying the infants drifted to the bank, where a she-wolf discovered them. Instead of harming them, she nursed them with her own milk, her warmth and protection keeping them alive beneath a fig tree. A shepherd later found them and raised them as his own, and the boys grew into natural leaders. They were named Romulus and Remus, and they became known for their courage and strength. As young men, they decided to build a city of their own. They chose the Palatine Hill, overlooking the river that had spared them. But a disagreement arose over which hill to use, and according to the oldest version, Romulus built a wall around his chosen site. Remus, mocking the wall, leaped over it. In the confrontation that followed, Remus fell. Some say Romulus struck the blow himself, others say it was one of his followers. The foundation of Rome was built on the loss of a brother. Romulus became the first king of the new city, and his reign set the patterns that would later define Roman rule. He organized the people into tribes, created a senate of elders, and welcomed newcomers from surrounding lands. Rome grew quickly, but its founder would not rule forever. One day, during a sudden storm, Romulus vanished. He was reviewing his army on the field of Mars when clouds gathered and thunder crashed. When the sky cleared, he was gone. The people searched, but no trace was found. Then a nobleman named Proculus Julius came forward with an astonishing claim. Romulus had appeared to him in a vision, radiant and armed. The founder had not died. He had ascended to join the gods. He was now Quirinus, a divine protector of the Roman people. That transformation was a political masterstroke. By declaring Romulus a god, the early Romans gave their city a sacred origin. The king who had founded the city was not merely a mortal hero. He was the son of Mars, the god of war, and had returned to the heavens. Every Roman who looked up at the sky could feel that their city was watched over by a divine founder. This belief justified the power of later rulers. When Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus, and when Augustus styled himself as the restorer of Rome, they were building on the Romulus story. The emperors were not just politicians. They were heirs to a god. The myth of Romulus and Quirinus became official propaganda. Temples were built to Quirinus, priests were appointed, and festivals celebrated the founder's divine status. Even the name of the Roman people, Quirites, echoed his divine name. For centuries, no one questioned that Rome was born of the gods, but historians offer a different view. The archaeological evidence shows that the Palatine Hill was indeed inhabited in the 8th century before the Common Era, and that a settlement gradually grew into a city. No wolf, no divine father, no sudden apotheosis. The story of Romulus and Remus was likely a later invention, shaped to unite a diverse population of Latins, Sabines, and others under a shared heroic ancestry. The conflict between the brothers may reflect ancient tribal tensions that were smoothed over by a founding legend, yet the power of the story outlived any factual debate. It gave Rome a soul, a sense of destiny that carried it through invasions, civil wars, and imperial expansion. The worship of Romulus as Quirinus lasted into the imperial era, and the phrase "from Romulus to the empire's end" became a way of measuring Roman history. Even after Christianity spread, the story was retold, stripped of its pagan gods but preserved as a cultural origin. Romulus was not a perfect king. He was ambitious, ruthless, and driven. But his myth taught that from violence and loss, a great civilization could rise, and that its leader could become something more than human. That same pattern, a mortal who earns a place among the gods, would echo across the Aegean Sea, where Greek heroes walked the line between Olympus and Earth. From a she-wolf who nurtured the founders of Rome, the story now turns to a Greek king who proved his divine birth by lifting a stone. Theseus was born from a mystery that even he could not fully solve. His mother Aethra spent a night with both a mortal king and a god, and when she gave birth, she could not say which father truly claimed the boy. Some say it was Poseidon, the earth shaker, who visited her on the island of Troezen. Others say it was King Aegeus of Athens, who left his sandals and sword beneath a massive rock as a test for his unborn son. Theseus grew up not knowing which story was true, but he knew that one day he would have to prove himself. When he came of age, his mother led him to the stone. He was strong, but even he struggled. The stone was ancient, half buried in the earth, and no one had moved it for 16 years. Theseus pushed until the muscles in his shoulders screamed, and finally the stone groaned and rolled aside. Beneath it lay the sandals and the sword of Aegeus. That moment defined his identity. He was the son of a king, but also a son of divine potential. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a sign that he was meant to rule. He set out for Athens not by the safe sea route but along the dangerous coastal path where bandits and monsters waited. He defeated them all, not with rage but with their own tricks. He turned their cruelty back on them. By the time he reached Athens, he had earned a reputation as a hero who used cunning as much as strength. The people of Athens were suffering. Every 9 years, they were forced to send 14 young men and women to Crete to be fed to the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull that lived in a labyrinth designed by the inventor Daedalus. Theseus volunteered to go as one of the tributes. He did not go to die, he went to end the terror. When he arrived in Crete, he met the king's daughter, Ariadne, who fell in love with him. She gave him a simple gift, a ball of thread. He tied one end to the entrance of the labyrinth and walked into the maze. In the heart of the maze, he faced the Minotaur. According to the old stories, he did not overpower it with brute force. He used his agility and the element of surprise. When it was over, he followed the thread back to the entrance, pulling his companions to safety. That victory made Theseus a hero across Greece. But when he returned to Athens, a tragic mistake awaited. He had promised his father Aegeus that if he succeeded, he would change the black sails of his ship to white. Overwhelmed with joy and perhaps forgetfulness, he left the black sails flying. Aegeus, watching from the cliffs, saw the black sails and believed his son was dead. In his grief, he threw himself into the sea. That body of water still bears his name, the Aegean Sea. Theseus became king of Athens, but the throne was won with a heavy heart. As king, Theseus did not try to rule alone. He is credited with a revolutionary act. He gathered the people of the scattered villages of Attica and united them into a single city. He created a central government, a council where citizens could speak, and a set of laws that applied to everyone. This is often called the founding of Athenian democracy, though it was not a democracy in the modern sense. It was a step away from absolute monarchy, a blend of human wisdom and divine favor. Theseus believed that a king should serve the people, not the other way around. He stepped back from some of his own power, allowing others to share in decision-making. Yet even this wise ruler could not escape the pull of myth. As centuries passed, the human Theseus became overshadowed by the demigod. Poets and playwrights emphasized his divine parentage. They said that before his final battle, he visited the underworld and saw the horrors of Tartarus. They said that when he died, his bones were brought back to Athens and placed in a temple where they were honored as relics of a sacred hero. The line between king and god blurred until Theseus stood alongside Hercules as a figure who had earned a place in the heavens. The Athenians used his story to claim that their city was founded not by chance, but by a hero chosen by the gods. This pattern appears again and again across the Greek world. Every major city had its own founder myth, a hero who cleared the land, defeated monsters, and established laws. These stories gave legitimacy to rulers and unity to the population. They turned local history into sacred history. Theseus was the Athenian version of that pattern, a king who was also a bridge between the mortal and the divine. His legend would inspire generations, but even as his fame spread, another kind of divine king was rising far to the south, in the heart of West Africa, where a warrior would forge an empire from iron and faith. Far to the south, in the rolling hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, a different kind of divine king emerged from a childhood marked by rejection and omens. Shaka Zulu was not born into ease. His mother Nandi, a woman of the Langeni clan, conceived him out of wedlock with the Zulu chief Senzangakona. The pregnancy itself became the first legend. Oral traditions say it lasted an entire year, far beyond the normal time. That unusual length was interpreted as a sign that the child carried extraordinary power. When he was born, the sky flashed with lightning and thunder rolled without rain. Some elders whispered that the infant could command the storm itself. But these omens did not bring him privilege. Instead, they brought fear. Senzangakona denied paternity at first, and Shaka grew up in the shadow of humiliation, mocked by other children and forced to flee with his mother when the chief eventually took another wife. That childhood of hardship shaped everything that followed. Shaka learned to fight with a ferocity born of survival. He developed a short stabbing spear called the Ikulwa, replacing the traditional throwing assegai. He trained his warriors to move in tight formations, using large cowhide shields to hook and unbalance opponents. These innovations turned the Zulu from a minor clan into a conquering force that reshaped the entire region. But the oral traditions did not credit Shaka alone for these victories. They attributed his military genius to the ancestral spirits, the Amadlozi, who guided him through visions and dreams. Before every major battle, Shaka would retreat to a sacred grove and consult with the spirits of past chiefs. He emerged with strategies that seemed to come from nowhere, and his soldiers believed he was invincible because the ancestors walked beside him. This belief was reinforced by the concept of royal umathai, a form of powerful medicine or magic reserved for the king. Specialists prepared concoctions from plants, minerals, and the remains of enemies, applied to Shaka's body and weapons to strengthen his connection to the spirit world. When he appeared on the battlefield with his skin gleaming with ointments and his shield painted with sacred symbols, his own warriors felt an almost religious awe, while enemies reported that his eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. His ruthlessness, the swift execution of those who opposed him, and the complete absorption of defeated tribes into his growing nation was framed not as cruelty but as divine justice. The ancestors demanded absolute loyalty, and any who resisted the will of the heavens deserved their fate. This logic made Shaka a figure beyond moral judgment. He was the instrument of a cosmic order that no human could question. Modern historians caution against sensationalizing his story. Many accounts were written by European colonizers who exaggerated his violence to justify their own conquests. The image of Shaka as a bloodthirsty monster is a distortion, one that ignores the political realities of a time when survival required strength. Yet the power of the myth remains undeniable. For the Zulu people, Shaka is not merely a historical figure. He is a founder, a unifier, and a symbol of resilience. His legacy lives in ceremonies, praise poems, and the pride of a nation that traces its roots to a king who could command the lightning. That same ambiguity between human ruler and divine force would appear again on the other side of the world, where Japanese emperors carried a sacred curse that bound them to the land in ways that defied ordinary explanation. One Japanese emperor's curse became so feared the court built shrines to contain his wrath. Emperor Sutoku of the 12th century was born into a world where divine status was both a gift and a prison. He ascended to the chrysanthemum throne as a child, but his reign was short. His father, the retired Emperor Toba, had never intended for Sutoku to rule for long. When Toba's favored son was born, he pressured Sutoku to abdicate, forcing him to step aside at the age of 23. For years, Sutoku lived in quiet exile, stripped of power but still bearing the sacred title of a former emperor. That title was not merely ceremonial. In the Shinto tradition, the emperor was a living kami, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Sutoku carried that divine essence within him, even in defeat. The tension finally erupted when a succession dispute sparked a civil war known as the Hojin Rebellion. Sutoku sided with the rebels, hoping to reclaim his rightful place. But the rebellion failed, and the imperial court showed no mercy. Instead of execution, which would have been unthinkable for a divine figure, they exiled Sutoku to a remote province. He was placed in a stock dwelling on the island of Shikoku, stripped of his retinue and any outward sign of his former glory. For years, he lived in isolation, copying sacred Buddhist sutras by hand in the hope that his devotion would earn him forgiveness. He sent the completed scriptures to the capital as a peace offering. The court refused to accept them. That rejection shattered something inside him. According to the chronicles, Sutoku vowed that he would become a great demon king and haunt the imperial line. He stopped cutting his hair and nails. He let his appearance grow wild and feral. He bit his own tongue and wrote a final curse in blood on the walls of his cell. When Sutoku finally passed away, his remains were treated with contempt. No proper funeral was held. His body was left to decay and his spirit was left unappeased, and then the nightmares began. Priests in the capital reported seeing a figure with red eyes and long claws drifting through the palace corridors. A series of fires broke out in the imperial compound, destroying buildings for no apparent reason. Key officials and members of the court fell to sudden illnesses. The most powerful men in the land began dying in ways that defied explanation. The people whispered that Sutoku had become an Oni, a vengeful spirit whose divine nature made his wrath incalculable. Ordinary ghosts could be pacified with simple rituals, but a former emperor, a living god who had been wronged beyond measure, that was a force that could tear the fabric of the world. The court panicked. They ordered sutras to be chanted continuously at temples. They appointed special priests to perform exorcisms. Nothing worked. The disasters continued. Finally, they built a shrine on the slopes of Mount Shuramin, the very place where Sutoku had been exiled, and dedicated it to his spirit. They gave him a new divine name, honored him with offerings, and declared that he was now a protective deity. This was not an act of remorse, it was an act of desperate negotiation. The court understood that a divine king, even a dead one, could not be defeated. He could only be appeased. The shrine became a place of official worship, and for centuries the imperial family made regular pilgrimages to beg for his mercy. Even today, the shrine stands, a quiet reminder that the power of a divine ruler does not end with breath. The story of Sutoku reveals the terrifying burden of divine kingship. When a ruler is expected to be perfect, infallible, and beyond human weakness, any failure becomes catastrophic. Sutoku was not allowed to be ambitious, angry, or wronged. His very divinity made his suffering unacceptable. The court could not admit that they had treated a god unjustly, so they tried to erase him, but the divine essence did not disappear. It turned inward and festered, emerging as a curse that haunted generations. This darker side of the legend shows that the line between a god-king and a monster is frighteningly thin. A ruler who is worshipped must also be feared, and when that fear turns to resentment, the entire system trembles. Sutoku's spirit was finally calmed, but the memory of his wrath shaped how later emperors were treated. They were given more honor, more ritual protection, and fewer direct challenges. The lesson was learned, at least for a time. From the shadowed mountains of Japan, the story now travels to the highlands of East Africa, where a different kind of divine lineage claimed descent from a biblical king. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia built its legitimacy on a single sacred text and a queen's legendary journey to Jerusalem. That tale would bind a nation's identity to the throne of King Solomon himself, and its echoes are still felt today. The legend of Menelik I begins with a queen and a king whose meeting changed the course of Ethiopian history. The Queen of Sheba, a wealthy and powerful ruler from the Horn of Africa, traveled to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. She arrived with a caravan of spices, gold, and precious stones, and she asked Solomon every question she could imagine. He answered them all. Impressed by his wealth and intellect, she stayed for a season. Before she left, Solomon gave her a ring and made her a promise. She returned to her kingdom and gave birth to a son, whom she named Menelik. When the boy came of age, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon recognized him immediately, not only by the ring but by the striking resemblance. He offered Menelik the throne of Israel, but the young man refused. He wanted to return to his mother's land. Solomon then commanded the firstborn sons of his nobles and priests to accompany Menelik as advisors and guardians. According to the Ethiopian tradition, these young men, unhappy about leaving their homeland, secretly took the Ark of the Covenant from the temple in Jerusalem and brought it with them. The Ark, the sacred chest containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, was the most holy object in all of Israel. Its removal was not theft in the eyes of the legend, but a divine act, a sign that God's favor had shifted from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Menelik became the first emperor of the Solomonic dynasty, and he established his capital at Aksum. From that moment, every Ethiopian emperor claimed descent from Menelik and through him from Solomon himself. This lineage was not a vague claim. It was recorded in the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of the Kings, a 14th century text that became the national epic. The book traces the royal line from the Queen of Sheba to the last emperor, Haile Selassie, who was deposed in 1974. For centuries, the Emperor of Ethiopia was not just a political leader. He was the Lion of Judah, the chosen representative of God on earth, and the guardian of the Ark. The Ark itself was housed in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum. Only one priest, the guardian, was allowed to see it. He lived his entire life in service to the Ark, never leaving the church compound. The annual celebration of the Ark, known as Timkat, involved a replica being carried through the streets in a procession of white-robed priests chanting, drumming, and waving incense. The people would bow and pray as the Ark passed, believing that its presence brought blessings, healing, and protection. This festival reinforced the emperor's authority because he was seen as the Ark's protector, the living link between heaven and the nation. The church and the throne were inseparably bound. The emperor appointed bishops, but the church also crowned the emperor, anointing him with holy oil and declaring him the elect of God. This partnership created a system where rebellion against the emperor was not only treason but sacrilege. The Solomonic dynasty endured for nearly 3,000 years, one of the longest continuous ruling lines in human history. Its power came not from armies or wealth alone, but from a story so deeply woven into the national identity that to question it was to question Ethiopia itself. That story gave the people a sense of chosenness, a belief that their land was protected by the same God who had led the Israelites out of Egypt. When modern historians examine the legend, they find little concrete evidence for the Ark's journey to Ethiopia. The Kebra Nagast was written centuries after the events it describes, and its purpose was clearly political, to give the Solomonic dynasty a divine mandate that rivaled the claims of European monarchs and Islamic caliphs. Yet the power of the story transcends historical accuracy. It shaped laws, wars, and the daily life of millions. It gave Ethiopian emperors a biblical genealogy that placed them on equal footing with the most ancient civilizations. And it created a unique form of divine kingship, one rooted not in pagan gods or mythological ancestors, but in the sacred texts of the Abrahamic faiths. That connection to scripture set the Solomonic dynasty apart from pharaohs or Inca sun kings, yet the underlying pattern remained the same: a ruler whose authority came from a higher power, whose presence was holy, and whose lineage was traced back to the very beginning of time. A comet streaked across Hawaiian skies in the year 1758. To the people watching from the shores of the Big Island, it was not a random celestial event. It was a sign. Priests and elders read the omen and whispered a prophecy. A great chief was about to be born, one who would unite all the warring islands under a single rule. That child was named Kamehameha, a name that means the lonely one or the set-apart one. His birth was surrounded by stories that would grow with every telling. Some said his umbilical cord was taken to a sacred rock and placed there by a prophet, ensuring that he would become a powerful leader. Others claimed that the gods themselves had chosen him to fulfill an ancient vision of unity. From his earliest years, Kamehameha was trained in the arts of warfare, navigation, and the sacred chants that connected chiefs to the divine. But he was not the only one with ambitions. The Hawaiian Islands at that time were divided into multiple chiefdoms, each ruled by an alii nui, a high chief who constantly fought for control. The prophecy that Kamehameha would unite them made him a target from childhood. He was hidden away by his guardians and raised in secret far from the courts of rival chiefs. When he emerged as a young warrior, he already carried the weight of expectation. In Hawaiian belief, a chief's power came from mana, a spiritual energy that could be inherited, earned, or lost. Mana flowed through the bloodline of the alii, who traced their ancestry directly to the gods Wakia, the Sky Father, and Papa, the Earth Mother. Every action a chief took either increased or diminished his mana. A successful battle, a wise decision, a generous gift, all of these added to it. A defeat, a broken taboo, a failure to provide for the people, these could drain it away. Kamehameha understood this deeply. He knew that to fulfill the prophecy, he had to accumulate more mana than any chief before him. He began by conquering neighboring districts one by one, using a combination of diplomacy and force. But his most important ally was not a mortal warrior. It was a war god named Kukailamoku, the Snatcher of Land. The god's image was a fearsome wooden figure with a feathered head and a gaping mouth, carried into battle on a special platform. Kamehameha consulted the god before every major campaign, offering prayers, chants, and sacrifices. The most sacred sacrifices were human, offered at Heiau, the stone temples that dotted the landscape. These rituals were not random acts of cruelty. They were seen as necessary exchanges, a way to feed the gods' hunger for mana and secure victory. Kamehameha believed that without Kukailamoku's favor, he could not succeed. The turning point came at the Battle of Niuanu in 1795. Kamehameha had already conquered most of the islands, but Oahu remained under the control of a powerful rival chief. The battle took place in the steep valley of Niuanu, where Kamehameha's warriors drove the opposing army up the slopes. Many of the defeated warriors were forced off the cliffs, falling hundreds of feet to their end. After that victory, only the island of Kauai remained independent. It surrendered peacefully a few years later, avoiding further conflict. Kamehameha became the first ruler to govern all the Hawaiian Islands as a single kingdom. He established a capital at Honolulu and set about creating a stable government. He encouraged trade with foreign ships, brought in new crops and technologies, and established laws that protected farmers and fishermen. He also maintained the traditional religious system, ensuring that the temples were kept and the rituals continued. To his subjects, he was not merely a powerful king. He was the fulfillment of a divine prophecy, a living symbol of the unity that the gods had intended for the islands. Historians today view Kamehameha as a brilliant strategist and a shrewd diplomat. They point to his careful alliances, his innovative use of Western weapons like cannons, and his ability to incorporate conquered chiefs into his administration. But the legend has always been larger than the facts. The comet that marked his birth, the prophecies that guided his path, the war god that fought beside him, these elements were not just decorations. They were essential to how the Hawaiian people understood his authority. The mana that Kamehameha accumulated was so great that even after his passing, his bones were hidden in a secret location, believed to hold such spiritual power that they could influence the land itself. To this day, no one knows where they rest. The story of Kamehameha is a perfect example of how divine kingship blends history with belief. The man and the myth are inseparable, each shaping the other. And just as Kamehameha's legend was built on sacred ancestry and earthly conquest, another story was unfolding on the other side of the world, where a prince born into a royal court chose to leave everything behind in search of a different kind of truth. One prince born into luxury chose to leave everything behind. Siddhartha Gautama was not a king who conquered lands or built empires. He was a prince who walked away from a throne, and his story became one of the most influential spiritual legends in human history. He was born into the Shakya clan in the foothills of the Himalayas, in a kingdom that was small but wealthy. His father, King Suddhodana, surrounded him with every comfort imaginable. Palaces built for each season, gardens of lotus ponds, musicians who played day and night, and servants who anticipated his every wish. The prince never saw sickness, old age, or death. His father had received a prophecy at his birth. The child would either become a great world ruler, a Chakravartin, or a great world renouncer, a spiritual teacher who would turn away from power. The king wanted the first option, so he built a wall of pleasure around his son, hoping to shield him from anything that might inspire a deeper calling. For 29 years, Siddhartha lived inside that golden cage. He married a beautiful princess named Yasodhara, and they had a son named Rahula. He had everything a person could desire, yet a restlessness grew beneath the surface. He began to wonder what lay beyond the palace gates. One day, he ordered his charioteer to take him into the city. What he saw shattered his innocence. First, he encountered an old man, bent and grey, leaning on a stick. Siddhartha had never seen aging before, and he asked his charioteer what it meant. The charioteer explained that all people grow old, that beauty fades and strength diminishes. The prince was shaken. On a second trip, he saw a person wasted by illness lying by the roadside. Again he asked, and again he learned that suffering was universal. No one was exempt. On a third journey, he saw a funeral procession, a body wrapped in cloth followed by mourners. He confronted the reality of death, the end that awaits everyone. These three sights, old age, sickness, and death, tore away the illusion of permanence that his father had built around him. But there was a fourth sight. On his final trip outside, he saw a wandering ascetic, a shaven-headed man in a simple robe, walking with calm purpose. The man had given up everything, yet his face radiated peace. Siddhartha understood that there was another path, not the path of power and pleasure, but the path of renunciation and inner freedom. That night, he made a decision that would echo through history. He went to his wife and son, sleeping peacefully, and he did not wake them. He feared that if he said goodbye, he would lose his resolve. He left the palace on his horse Kanthoka, with only his charioteer Channa as a companion. At the edge of the forest, he cut off his long hair with a sword, exchanged his silk robes for a beggar's cloth, and sent Channa and the horse back. He had become a wandering seeker, a prince who chose poverty over power. The drama of this moment comes precisely from his royal background. If Siddhartha had been born a peasant, his leaving would have been less striking. But he had tasted every luxury, every comfort, every pleasure that human society could offer. He knew firsthand that none of it could satisfy the deeper hunger. His renunciation was not born of ignorance but of direct experience. He had tested the world of the senses and found it hollow. That made his spiritual quest more powerful as a story and more convincing as a teaching. Later Buddhist traditions expanded his legend backward in time. They taught that Siddhartha had lived countless previous lives, many of them as kings, princes, and wealthy merchants. In those lives, he had practiced the 10 perfections or paramis: generosity, morality, renunciation, wisdom, effort, patience, truthfulness, determination, loving kindness, and equanimity. Each life prepared him for the final birth where he would achieve enlightenment. In one previous life, as the Bodhisattva, he was a king named Vesantara who gave away everything, including his own children, as the ultimate act of generosity. That story, told across Southeast Asia, reinforces the idea that true kingship is measured not by what one holds, but by what one releases. Siddhartha's legend serves as a profound cautionary tale about impermanence. The palaces, the gardens, the servants, the family, all of it was temporary. The prince who had everything understood that even a throne is a cage if it keeps you from the truth. His journey from luxury to asceticism to the middle way, and finally to awakening under the Bodhi tree, became a model for millions. Yet the story also carries a subtle warning for any ruler who believes their power is eternal. No matter how high the walls, no matter how many pleasures are piled on, the 4 sights wait outside. Age, sickness, death, and the search for meaning will eventually break through. This theme connects back to the earliest legends of divine kingship, where rulers tried to defy mortality with monuments and magic. In Mesopotamia, before the Great Flood, there were kings who reigned for thousands of years according to the Sumerian king list. Those antediluvian rulers, like Ulurum and Alalnga, were said to have descended from heaven itself. Their reigns stretched into mythic lengths, yet even they could not escape the flood that swept away their world. Siddhartha's legend reminds us that no crown, no matter how divine, can protect against the truth of change. The prince who became the Buddha offers a different kind of rule, one based not on power over others but on freedom within. Long before the Buddha, another tradition claimed kingship itself fell from the sky. The ancient Sumerians believed that the right to rule was not invented by humans but was a gift from the gods, lowered into the world at the dawn of time. This idea is preserved in a remarkable document known as the Sumerian King List, a clay tablet that records the names, reigns, and dynasties of kings stretching back to the very beginning of civilization. According to the list, the first rulers were not ordinary mortals. They were demigods or direct appointees of the divine, and their reigns lasted an astonishing length of time, tens of thousands of years. The opening lines of the king list are famous. After kingship descended from heaven, the text says, it first settled in the city of Eridu. There, a king named Ulurum ruled for 28,800 years. Then his successor, Alalnga, reigned for 36,000 years. These numbers are not meant to be taken as literal historical facts. They serve a different purpose. They paint a picture of a perfect golden age when the gods walked among humans and order was so stable that rulers could live for eons. The impossibly long reigns symbolized an era of harmony when the divine blueprint for society was still fresh and uncorrupted. In this primordial world, the king was not just a political leader. He was the steward of heaven's order, responsible for maintaining the connection between the gods and the people. Another figure from this early period is Dumuzid, a shepherd king who appears in both the king list and in later mythology as the beloved consort of the goddess Inanna. His reign was listed as 36,000 years as well. Dumuzid's story is complex and tragic, involving his death and resurrection, which made him a symbol of the seasonal cycle. But in the king list, he is simply one of the first rulers, a link in the chain that stretched from the divine origin of kingship to the historical dynasties that followed. The purpose of the Sumerian king list was not historical record in the modern sense. It was a political tool. By tracing their lineage back to these antediluvian demigods, later kings claimed a share of that ancient legitimacy. A ruler in the city of or Uruk could say, "My ancestor was appointed by heaven, and therefore my authority is sacred." The list was constantly updated and edited as new dynasties rose and fell, each one inserting its own founders into the chain. This created a narrative of unbroken divine favor, even when empires crumbled and new powers emerged. The belief in these primordial rulers also reinforced the idea that kingship was a cosmic duty, not a human ambition. The king was chosen by the gods, and his role was to maintain justice, build temples, and ensure the land's fertility. If he failed, the gods could withdraw their favor, as they did in the story of the Great Flood. The flood itself, according to Sumerian myth, was a divine reset. After the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven again, starting a new cycle in the city of Kish. This second beginning gave later rulers a fresh start, but the link to the antediluvian age remained essential. The memory of those first, impossibly long reigns served as an ideal, a golden standard that real kings could never match. It set the bar for what divine rule should look like: perfect, stable, everlasting. As Sumerian culture gave way to Babylonian civilization, this idea of the God-chosen king did not disappear. It evolved. The Babylonian king Hammurabi, for example, claimed that the god Marduk had granted him the laws to govern the people. The famous Code of Hammurabi begins with a prologue that lists the king's divine appointments and his role as shepherd of the people. This was the same logic, dressed in new language. The king was still the chosen representative of heaven, even if the names of the gods changed. The transition from Sumerian to Babylonian divine kingship was smooth because the underlying belief was shared. Authority flows from above, and the ruler is the channel through which divine order reaches the earth. That idea would persist for thousands of years, shaping the politics and religion of the entire ancient Near East. In Babylon, that idea found its most powerful expression in the god Marduk. He was not always the head of the pantheon. For centuries, older gods like Enlil held the highest rank. But as the city of Babylon grew from a small settlement into a mighty empire, its patron god rose with it. The story of Marduk's ascent is recorded in a sacred poem called the Enuma Elish, which means when on high. It was recited every year during the New Year festival, a ritual that reminded everyone why Babylon was the center of the world. The poem describes a time before time when only fresh water and salt water existed, represented by the gods Apsu and Tiamat. Their children, the younger gods, made so much noise that Apsu decided to destroy them. But the younger gods killed Apsu first. Then Tiamat, the saltwater dragon, became enraged and created an army of monsters to take revenge. The younger gods were terrified. No one could stand against her. Then Marduk stepped forward. He agreed to fight Tiamat, but only on one condition. If he succeeded, the gods would make him their supreme ruler forever. They agreed. Marduk armed himself with a bow, arrows, a net, and the four winds. He faced Tiamat, caught her in his net, and when she opened her mouth to swallow him, he drove a wind into her belly that inflated her like a balloon. Then he shot an arrow that split her in two. From one half he made the sky, from the other the earth. He set the stars in their courses and created humanity from the blood of a rebel god, so that humans could serve the gods and relieve them of labor. The other gods, awed by Marduk's power, built him a great temple in Babylon. They gave him 50 names, each one a title of supreme authority. He was now the king of all gods. This myth was not just a story about the heavens, it was a mirror for the earth. The Babylonian king was Marduk's earthly representative. Just as Marduk defeated chaos to establish cosmic order, the king was expected to defeat earthly chaos, foreign enemies, internal rebellion, and natural disasters. The king's victory was a reflection of Marduk's victory. His authority was not his own, it was borrowed from the god. The most famous of these kings, Nebuchadnezzar II, understood this perfectly. He rebuilt Babylon into the most magnificent city of its age, with towering walls, a grand palace, and the legendary hanging gardens. He also restored the temple of Marduk, the Esagila, and its great ziggurat, the Etemenanki, which some scholars believe inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. On clay cylinders and stone monuments, Nebuchadnezzar called himself the provider of Esagila, the one who makes splendid the cult of Marduk. Every brick he laid was an offering to the god. Every war he fought was a campaign to extend Marduk's order. The connection between the king and Marduk was made visible during the Akitu festival, the New Year celebration that lasted 11 or 12 days. At the heart of the festival was the statue of Marduk. This was not a simple carving. It was believed to be the physical vessel of the god's presence on earth, dressed in gold and lapis lazuli, kept in a sacred chamber deep within the temple. Only the king and the high priest were allowed to see it. During Akitu, the statue was carried in a grand procession through the city gates, accompanied by priests, musicians, and offerings. The king would take Marduk's hand, a gesture that symbolized the renewal of their covenant. The king would also perform a ritual humiliation. He would remove his royal regalia, kneel before the statue, and declare that he had not neglected his duties or allowed injustice to flourish. Only after this confession was he reinvested with his crown and scepter, his authority reaffirmed for another year. This ceremony did two things at once. It reminded the people that the king's power came from Marduk, not from his own strength, and it gave the king a powerful tool to silence critics. Any challenge to his rule could be framed as an attack on Marduk himself. The cosmic myth and the political reality were woven so tightly that they could not be separated. When Babylon fell to the Persians, the conquerors understood this. Cyrus the Great presented himself as the chosen servant of Marduk, claiming that the god had appointed him to restore order. He even returned the statues of other gods that the Babylonians had captured, a brilliant political move that used the same divine logic to legitimize a new dynasty. The pattern was clear: whoever controlled the story of Marduk controlled the kingdom. This blending of divine narrative and royal authority would also shape the work of another Mesopotamian lawgiver, whose code would echo through the centuries. On a tall stone slab, a king meets a god. The image carved at the top of the stele of Hammurabi shows the Babylonian ruler standing before the seated sun god Shamash. Shamash holds a ring and a rod, symbols of authority and justice, and extends them toward the king. Hammurabi raises his hand in a gesture of reverence. The message is unmistakable. These laws do not come from a man, they come from heaven itself. The stele was erected in the city of Babylon, probably in the temple of Marduk, where everyone could see it. It was not just a legal document, it was a monument to divine authorization. The code itself contains nearly 300 laws, covering everything from property disputes to family matters to professional standards. The punishments are often severe, but the underlying principle is one of order. The prologue sets the stage. Hammurabi declares that the gods Anu and Enlil, the highest deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, appointed him to bring justice to the land. He calls himself the shepherd of the people, a title that would echo through later rulers. A shepherd does not own the flock, he cares for it on behalf of its true owner, the divine. This language frames Hammurabi as a caretaker, a conduit through which cosmic justice flows down to the human world. The epilogue reinforces this message even more strongly. It warns that any future ruler who ignores these laws or alters them will face divine punishment. The gods themselves will curse his dynasty, his land, and his name. This is not a threat from a king who believes his own power is absolute. It is a warning from a king who claims to be merely the channel for a higher authority. The laws are sacred. To break them is to defy the gods. Later Babylonian kings copied this formula. They used the same language of divine appointment, the same titles of shepherd and chosen one. Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, and others left inscriptions that echoed Hammurabi's style. They presented themselves as restorers of divine order, not innovators. The continuity of this language gave the Babylonian monarchy a stability that lasted for centuries. Even when foreign conquerors took the throne, they adopted the same rhetoric. Cyrus the Great, when he entered Babylon, claimed that Marduk had chosen him to set things right. This approach contrasts sharply with later legal systems that developed in more secular context. The Roman 12 tables, for example, were presented as the work of a commission, not a deity. The Napoleonic Code was drafted by jurists and statesmen, not prophets. Hammurabi's code made no such separation. The law was religion, and the king was its voice on earth. That same fusion of divine mandate and legal authority would reappear in a different form centuries later, on the other side of the world, when a Buddhist emperor used a different kind of sacred language to unite his realm. A Buddhist emperor in 7th century India claimed his throne was not earned but inherited from a higher source. Harsha of Kanauj ruled over a vast northern empire, but his authority rested on something far older than his armies. He was believed by many to be an incarnation of the Buddha himself, reborn into the world to restore righteousness and protect the faith. This was not a boast he made in official inscriptions. It was a reputation woven by poets, monks, and the pilgrims who flocked to his court. The most detailed record of Harsha's reign comes from the Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled across India for 17 years and spent time in Harsha's kingdom. Xuanzang described a ruler who was both powerful and devout, a king who personally supervised the construction of monasteries, sponsored debates between scholars, and distributed his wealth to the poor. But Xuanzang also noted something deeper. The people of Kanauj spoke of Harsha not as a mere patron of Buddhism, but as a living embodiment of its founder. In some traditions, it was said that Harsha was born under miraculous circumstances. His mother, the queen, had a dream in which a radiant figure descended from heaven and entered her womb. The court astrologers interpreted this as a sign that the child would be a great king or a spiritual teacher. When Harsha was born, the palace was filled with a golden light, and flowers rained from the sky according to the legend. These details were not unique to Harsha. They echoed the birth stories of other divine rulers across cultures, but in this case the divine figure was not a sun god or a warrior deity. It was the Buddha, a teacher who had explicitly rejected the trappings of kingship. This was a paradox that Harsha's court managed with careful diplomacy. They presented him as both a Chakravartin, a world ruler who conquers through moral authority, and a bodhisattva, a being on the path to enlightenment. He held grand assemblies called the Mahamoksha Parisha, great gatherings of monks, scholars, and pilgrims from across Asia. These events were part religious festival, part political rally. At the center of each gathering sat Harsha, dressed in the simple robes of a monk but crowned with the authority of an emperor. He would personally offer alms to thousands of monks, distribute food to the poor, and then lead processions carrying relics of the Buddha. The effect was deliberate. Every ritual reinforced the idea that Harsha was not just a king who supported Buddhism, but a king who was Buddhism made flesh. This adaptation shows how divine kingship could survive even when the gods changed. The old Mesopotamian and Egyptian models had tied the ruler to specific deities like Marduk or Ra. But Harsha's court took a different approach. They did not claim that the king was a new god. Instead, they claimed he was a return of the old teacher, a reincarnation of the enlightened one. This made Harsha's authority uniquely flexible. It did not require him to be a warrior or a builder of temples. It required him to be a model of compassion, generosity, and wisdom. And because the Buddha's teachings were universal, Harsha's claim could reach beyond his own kingdom. Pilgrims from China, Tibet, and Southeast Asia came to see the living Buddha, and they carried his reputation back to their homelands. The Chinese emperor himself heard of Harsha, and a diplomatic exchange was attempted, though the records are fragmentary. What remains is a portrait of a ruler who understood that the most enduring power is not the sword but the story. Harsha's dynasty did not last long after his passing, but the legend of the Buddhist emperor who was also a living incarnation continued to influence rulers in Tibet, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia for centuries. It proved that the template of divine kingship could be rewritten for any faith as long as the core claim remained. The ruler is not ordinary, he is chosen, blessed, and set apart. From that idea, the next step was a short one, for even in distant China, signs in the sky and strange births were already being interpreted as omens of a new emperor's divine right. In the year 94 before the Common Era, a Qilin appeared in the palace gardens. That mythical creature, a blend of deer, dragon, and ox, covered in scales and crowned with a single horn, was not a random visitor. It was a message from heaven, a sign that the gods were about to bless the Han dynasty with a new ruler. The child born shortly after was named Zhao, and his arrival was surrounded by a chorus of auspicious omens. Strange lights flickered in the night sky. The earth delivered bountiful harvests. Officials wrote glowing reports of cranes circling the imperial compound, and the court historians recorded every detail as proof that heaven had chosen this infant. But a Qilin was not a guarantee of a long or powerful reign. Emperor Zhao ascended the throne at the age of 8. His father, the great Emperor Wu, had expanded the Han Empire to its greatest extent, but he had also left a court exhausted by war and deeply divided. A child could not rule such a realm alone, so a regent was appointed. That regent was Huo Guang, a man who understood that the illusion of divine authority could be just as useful as the real thing. Huo Guang did not try to seize the throne for himself. He knew that would invite rebellion. Instead, he wrapped the young emperor in layers of ritual and symbolism, making sure that every public appearance reinforced the idea that Zhao was heaven's chosen. The boy was dressed in the most elaborate robes, seated on the tallest throne, and surrounded by chanting priests who recited the omens of his birth. Court poets composed hymns comparing him to the mythical Yellow Emperor and to the sage kings of antiquity. Every word was designed to drown out the whispers that the throne was actually held by the regent. The manipulation worked for a time. Zhao grew up surrounded by false reverence, never questioning the stories that had been built around him, but the cracks were visible. The real decisions were made behind closed doors by Huo Guang and his allies. The grain distribution, the tax rates, the military campaigns, all of it flowed from the regent's hand, not the child emperor's. Zhao was a figurehead, a living amulet meant to ward off chaos while the adults ran the state. When he finally died at the age of 21, the official records noted it as a peaceful passing. But there were rumors. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, that Huo Guang had grown tired of the charade and replaced Zhao with a puppet he could control even more easily. The truth is lost, but the pattern is clear. The divine omens that had once legitimized Zhao were now used to justify his replacement. A new emperor was found, and a new set of auspicious signs were manufactured to support him. The kiln that had appeared at Zhao's birth was quickly forgotten, its meaning twisted or erased by the same officials who had once celebrated it. This story shows how fragile the myth of divine kingship could be. When the ruler was strong, the omens were proof of his power. When the ruler was weak, the omens became tools for those who held the real authority. The kiln was not a living creature. It was a political symbol, and symbols can be rewritten. Even a child emperor could be turned into a god, but only as long as the court needed him to be one. The moment his usefulness ended, the divine mask was removed, and the mortal face beneath was easily discarded. That same cold logic of divine legitimacy would soon be tested across the desert, where an Assyrian queen would claim power not through a kiln but through ambition and blood. Semiramis did not wait for omens, she made her own. The Assyrian queen who would become a legend began as a rumor, a story whispered by merchants and scribes about a woman who ruled with the authority of a god and the ambition of a conqueror. According to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, Semiramis was no ordinary mortal. Her mother was Derkito, a fish goddess who abandoned her at birth. Doves fed the infant until she was found by a royal shepherd. She grew into a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence, and she caught the eye of the Assyrian king Ninus. He married her, and when he died, she took the throne, but she did not merely inherit power. She redefined it. She raised an army, led campaigns across Persia and Egypt, and according to the legend, founded the great city of Babylon. She ordered the construction of towering walls, grand temples, and the famous hanging gardens, a wonder of the ancient world. She even commanded supernatural forces, calling upon the winds to aid her in battle and the waters of the Euphrates to shape her city. The historical figure behind this myth was Shamiramat, the wife of King Shamshi Adad V, who ruled as regent after his death. She was a real woman who held real power in the 9th century before the Common Era. But over time, her story merged with that of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. Semiramis became a living symbol of divine female authority, a queen who was both worshipped and feared. The line between human and goddess blurred until it was impossible to tell where Shamiramat ended and Ishtar began. This blending was complex. female rulers who claimed divine status were often portrayed as either benevolent goddesses bringing fertility and order, or as monstrous figures whose power threatened the natural order. Semiramis was both. In some accounts, she was a wise builder and a just ruler. In others, she was a seductress who used her charms to manipulate kings and a tyrant who demanded absolute obedience. The double standard was clear. A male god-king was a protector. A female god-queen was a puzzle, a challenge to be explained away, yet Semiramis endured. Her name appeared in the writings of Herodotus, Pliny, and countless others. She became a template for later queens who would also claim divine favor, from Cleopatra to the Byzantine empresses. Her story reminds us that divine kingship was never a purely male tradition, though it was often shaped by male storytellers. As the legend of Semiramis spread across the ancient world, it reached the shores of a small Greek island, where another ruler was about to weave his own lineage into the fabric of the cosmos. Minos ruled Crete with laws he said were given by Zeus himself. According to the myth, his father was the king of the gods who had fallen in love with a Phoenician princess named Europa. Zeus took the form of a gentle white bull and carried her across the sea to the island where their son Minos was born. That divine parentage set Minos apart from every other ruler in the Aegean. He claimed that the gods had granted him not only the laws that governed his people but also dominance over the surrounding seas. His navy, he said, was a gift from Poseidon, and no enemy could stand against it. But the same divine favor that gave him wisdom also planted the seeds of his greatest trial. Minos prayed to Poseidon for a sign to confirm his right to rule. The god sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, a creature so perfect that Minos was supposed to sacrifice it in honor. Greed or pride made him keep the bull for himself and offer an ordinary animal instead. Poseidon was not pleased. He cursed Minos' wife Pasiphae with an unnatural desire for the bull. She enlisted the master craftsman Daedalus to build a hollow wooden cow, and from that union a child was born who was neither fully human nor fully beast. That being, known as the Minotaur, was a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Minos could not bring himself to kill it, so he ordered Daedalus to construct a labyrinth beneath his palace, a maze of twisting corridors that no one could escape. There the Minotaur was confined, and it became the center of a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, the Athenians were forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women to be placed inside the labyrinth. They never came out. This story, though soaked in tragedy, reveals a deeper pattern. Minos was not just a mythological figure. The ancient Greeks treated him as a historical king who had brought civilization to Crete. Historians like Thucydides wrote about his navy and his suppression of piracy. The island's later rulers minted coins that showed Minos seated on a throne, holding a scepter or a scroll with the words lawgiver inscribed beside him. Those images were not merely decorative. They declared that Minos was a divine legislator, a ruler whose authority came directly from heaven and whose laws were beyond question. Even the Athenian playwrights who told stories of the Minotaur and the hero Theseus acknowledged Minos' power while criticizing his arrogance. He was a figure who commanded both respect and fear. Modern archaeology paints a very different picture. The Minoan civilization that flourished on Crete between 2700 and 1400 before the Common Era was not ruled by a single god-king named Minos. The name was likely a title similar to pharaoh used for a line of kings. The palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia were not defensive fortresses but sprawling administrative centers filled with storage rooms, workshops, and grand courtyards. The famous frescoes show bull leaping, a ritual sport in which acrobats vaulted over the horns of charging bulls. That image may have inspired the myth of the Minotaur. But there is no evidence of a labyrinth, no trace of a half-bull monster. The real Minoans were a seafaring people who traded with Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. They wrote in a script we call Linear A, which remains undeciphered, leaving their own voice silent. Their civilization collapsed around 1400 before the Common Era, possibly due to volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or invasion. The memory of their power, however, lingered in Greek oral tradition and became woven into the legend of Minos. The same impulse that turned the Minoan kings into divine figures would soon re-emerge along the Nile, where a woman dared to claim the throne of the pharaohs as her own and rule as a living god. On the walls of a temple in Deir el-Bahri, a god descends to a queen. The reliefs carved into the limestone tell a story that was essential for a woman who dared to become pharaoh. Hatshepsut, the fifth ruler of the 18th dynasty, needed more than ambition to claim the throne. She needed a divine mandate written in stone. The scenes show the god Ammon approaching Queen Ahmose, Hatshepsut's mother, in the form of her husband. He places the Ankh, the symbol of life, to her nostrils and she conceives. Later, the god announces to the assembled gods that this daughter shall be a great ruler. This was not a simple birth announcement. It was a legal document, a sacred contract that declared Hatshepsut the chosen daughter of the king of the gods. In a society where the pharaoh was the living Horus, a woman could not simply inherit the throne through human lineage. The divine birth narrative solved that problem. It gave Hatshepsut a direct supernatural origin that bypassed the normal rules of succession. She was not merely the daughter of a mortal king. She was the flesh and blood of Ammon himself, and no earthly tradition could override that. The temple reliefs did not stop at the birth. They continued with scenes of Hatshepsut being crowned by the gods, presented with the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. Priests shown in the carvings declare prophecies that she would be a just and powerful ruler. These images were displayed prominently for pilgrims and officials who visited the mortuary temple. They served as constant reminders that her authority came from heaven, not from human approval, and Hatshepsut used that authority brilliantly. Her reign lasted about 22 years, a period of peace and prosperity. She launched a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back myrrh trees, gold, and exotic animals. She commissioned obelisks and monuments that celebrated her rule. She governed as a pharaoh in full, wearing the traditional false beard and the royal regalia, blending masculine and feminine symbols to project her divine status. Yet the very success of her reign would later become a liability. After her death, her successor Thutmose III, or perhaps his advisors, began a systematic campaign to erase Hatshepsut from history. Her images were chiseled off temple walls, her name was removed from royal lists, her statues were smashed or buried. For centuries, she was almost forgotten, a ghost in the Egyptian record. The reasons for this erasure are debated. It may have been a political move to legitimize Thutmose's own son, or a way to restore the traditional male line of succession. But the act itself reveals something crucial. Hatshepsut's divine birth narrative, so carefully constructed, was not strong enough to protect her memory from human politics. The gods could grant a mandate, but only living rulers could enforce it. Her story shows how gender shaped the claims of divine kingship. A male pharaoh's divine birth was often implied or assumed. A female pharaoh had to prove it in writing, in stone, and in public ceremonies. Hatshepsut succeeded in her lifetime, but the fragility of her legacy speaks to the limits of even the most sacred stories. As her monuments crumbled, another kind of ruler was being remembered in the misty hills of the Celtic world, where kings claimed descent from the gods of the other world, and where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin enough to whisper through. In the misty green hills of ancient Ireland, a race of beings walked the land who were neither fully god nor fully mortal. They were the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, and they ruled the island long before the first human kings ever set foot on its shores. According to the medieval texts that preserved their memory, these beings arrived in a cloud of mist and smoke, carrying with them 4 treasures: the spear of Lug, the sword of Nuada, the cauldron of the Dagda, and the Lia Fail, the stone of destiny. This last treasure was not a simple stone. It was a living oracle, a marker of divine kingship. When a rightful ruler stood upon it, the stone would cry out with a roar that could be heard across the entire province. This was no ordinary coronation. It was a sacred test, a moment when heaven itself validated the king. One of the most famous kings of the Tuatha De Danann was Nuada of the Silver Hand. During a fierce battle against their enemies, the Firbolg, Nuada lost his right arm. In the ancient code of the Tuatha De Danann, a king could not be physically blemished. His body had to be whole because his body represented the land itself. If the king was wounded, the land would suffer, so Nuada was removed from the throne and a new king took his place. But the surgeon god Dian Set crafted a working silver arm for him, and Nuada returned to rule once more. This story reveals a deep connection between the ruler's physical state and the health of the kingdom, a belief that would echo in later Irish traditions where kings were expected to be flawless, strong, and free of blemish. Then came Lug, the High King of the Tuatha De Danann. Lug was known as the many-skilled one, a master of every art and craft. He led his people in a great war against the oppressive Fomorians, a race of monstrous beings. With his magical spear that never missed its mark, Lug defeated the one-eyed King Balor and secured freedom for the Tuatha De Danann. After that victory, he became the supreme ruler. His reign was a golden age of prosperity and creativity. The medieval texts describe him as a radiant figure associated with the sun, with wisdom and skill that seemed more than human. But the story of the Tuatha De Danann does not end with their triumph. After centuries of rule, a new wave of invaders arrived, the Milesians, ancestors of the modern Gaels. The Tuatha De Danann were defeated and forced to retreat. They did not die. They vanished into the hills, into the mounds known as Shia, and became the fairy folk of later legend. The kings and queens of the Tuatha De Danann transformed into the lords of the otherworld, invisible but still present, still watching over the land. This transition from divine rulers to hidden spirits allowed the Irish to maintain their reverence for these ancient beings while also accepting a new human dynasty. The sacred kingship rituals of the Tuatha De Danann, especially the Roaring Stone, set a template for later Irish monarchs. For centuries, the stone was used at coronations and countless legends surrounded it. It was said that the stone would groan under the rightful king, and if a false claimant sat upon it, the stone would remain silent or even crack. This belief continued into the medieval period, where Irish kings traced their lineages back to these divine ancestors. The myth of the Tuatha De Danann gave legitimacy to every ruler who came after. They were not just kings of men, they were heirs to the gods. From the green hills of Ireland, the story of divine kingship now travels across the globe to the lush river valleys of Southeast Asia, where another tradition of god kings would rise and shape empires that still inspire awe today. On a sacred mountain in Cambodia, a king declared himself a living god. That king was Jayavarman II, and the year was roughly 802 of the Common Era. He stood atop Phnom Kulen, a plateau thick with jungle and waterfalls, and performed a ritual that would reshape the spiritual and political landscape of Southeast Asia. He brought together Brahmin priests from the Indian subcontinent and local Khmer traditions, and together they established the cult of the devaraja, the god king. The ritual centered on a linga, a sacred stone symbol representing the Hindu god Shiva, the cosmic creator and destroyer. The king placed the linga on the mountain, and from that moment he was no longer merely a mortal ruler. He was the earthly embodiment of Shiva himself, the divine source of order and power. This was not a vague metaphor, it was a precise theological claim. In the Hindu tradition, the king was seen as a protector of Dharma, the universal law, but in the Khmer adaptation, the king did not just serve the gods. He merged with them. The devaraja cult taught that the king's soul was infused with the essence of Shiva, and that the state itself was a reflection of the divine cosmos. The temple that housed the royal linga was built as a mountain, a representation of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods. Every capital city had such a temple, rising step by step above the surrounding plains, its towers carved to resemble the peaks of heaven. The king's authority flowed from this sacred center outward, unifying the empire under a single divine mandate. Jayavarman II did not build the most famous of these temples. That honor belongs to his successors, especially Suryavarman II, who constructed Angkor Wat. But Jayavarman planted the seed. He conquered rival principalities and forged them into a single kingdom known as the Khmer Empire. To hold it together, he needed a story that transcended local loyalties. The devaraja provided that story. Every noble, every general, every farmer could see that the king was connected to a power far greater than any human army. The linga was not just a stone, it was the anchor of heaven on earth, and the king was its living guardian. Angkor Wat, built 3 centuries after Jayavarman's reign, shows how far this idea had evolved. The temple complex was not a place of worship for the people, it was the king's personal gateway to the divine. Its layout mirrors the celestial mountain with a central tower that reaches above all others, symbolizing the axis of the world. The walls are covered in bas-reliefs depicting scenes from Hindu epics, but also scenes of the king himself, sitting in judgment, leading processions and connecting with the gods. When the king passed away, the temple became his mausoleum. It was believed that his spirit would ascend to the heavens from that very spot, merging forever with Shiva or Vishnu, depending on the dynasty. Angkor Wat was not built for the living. It was built for a king's divine afterlife, a stone ladder from the mortal world to the realm of the gods. Later, as the Khmer Empire encountered Theravada Buddhism, the devaraja concept began to shift. Buddhist kings still claimed a special connection to the divine, but they no longer identified directly with Hindu gods. Instead, they were seen as bodhisattvas, enlightened beings who postponed their own liberation to guide the kingdom. The temples became more austere, less focused on the linga and more on the image of Buddha. Yet the underlying structure remained. The king was still the pivot between heaven and earth, the one whose actions determined the prosperity of the land. Angkor itself was eventually abandoned to the jungle, but the memory of the god kings lingered in the carvings and the crumbling stone. As the Khmer devaraja faded into the forest, another tradition of divine kingship was already ancient by the time Jayavarman climbed Phnom Kulen. Far to the west along the Nile, a god had walked among men, a figure who was once a king and later became something more. That god was Imhotep, a man whose wisdom was so great that the Egyptians raised him to the heavens. Osiris was not born a god of the underworld. He was once a mortal king who walked the banks of the Nile, teaching his people how to farm, how to build, and how to live in harmony with the land. The ancient records describe him as a ruler who brought civilization itself to Egypt, a figure of wisdom and generosity who was beloved by all. But his brother Set was consumed by envy. In the old stories, Set tricked Osiris into a chest, sealed it, and cast it into the river. Osiris was lost. His wife Isis searched tirelessly until she found his remains, but Set's jealousy did not end there. He scattered the pieces across the land, yet Isis, with her devotion and her knowledge of sacred rites, gathered them and performed a ritual that brought Osiris back, not to the world of the living, but to a new existence as the lord of the afterlife. He became the judge of the dead, the one who weighs the hearts of souls against a feather. This was not a simple tale of betrayal and revenge. It was a blueprint for Egyptian kingship itself. Every pharaoh, upon ascending the throne, was identified with Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis. The living ruler was Horus, the protector of order, while the deceased king became Osiris, the ruler of the underworld. This cycle of death and renewal was reenacted every year in the great festivals of Osiris. In the city of Abydos, priests would carry a model of the god's shrine in a solemn procession, reenacting the search for his remains. Crowds of pilgrims would chant and weep and then rejoice when the god was restored. The festivals were not just religious ceremonies, they were political statements, reminders that the king's authority came from a divine lineage that had conquered death itself. The paradox at the heart of the Osiris myth is striking. A dead king becomes the ultimate judge of all souls. Mortal rulers came and went, but Osiris remained eternal and unmoved. His story gave the pharaohs a powerful promise. Even after their bodies were laid to rest, they would join him in the fields of Iru, a paradise of endless harvest. The pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead are filled with spells and prayers meant to guide the king safely through the underworld, past dangerous demons and treacherous gates, to stand before Osiris and be justified. This belief in a dying and rising god was not unique to Egypt. It would appear again in other cultures, from the Phoenician god Adonis to the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna. But the Egyptian version was the most deeply woven into the fabric of state power. The pharaoh did not just worship Osiris, he became Osiris at the moment of his passing, and in doing so, he guaranteed the continuity of the kingdom. That same logic of sacred lineage would soon echo across the vast grasslands of the steppe, where another kind of ruler claimed descent from the sky itself. The golden plough, the yoke, the battle axe, and the drinking cup fell from the sky onto the Scythian plain. According to the legend preserved by the Greek historian Herodotus, these four objects blazed with a light that no mortal dared approach. They lay there, shimmering, untouched, until a man named Tarjetaus arrived. He was no ordinary man. His father was Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, and his mother was a nymph, the daughter of the great Dnieper River itself. That mixed lineage gave him the courage to walk toward the fiery gifts. When he reached out, the objects did not burn him. They cooled at his touch, and he claimed them as his own. The other people of the land recognized what had happened. This was no accident. The gods had chosen Tarjetaus to be their first king. The story served a purpose far beyond mere entertainment. The Scythians were a nomadic people who roamed the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea. They had no cities, no written records, and no permanent temples. Their identity was carried in their horses, their weapons, and their oral traditions. The tale of the golden objects falling from heaven gave them a fixed point of origin, a sacred beginning that tied their entire nation to the will of Zeus. Tarjetaus became the ancestor of all Scythian kings, and his three sons, Lipaxes, Arpaxes, and Colaxes, divided the land among themselves. But only the youngest, Colaxes, was allowed to handle the golden objects. This detail reinforced a clear hierarchy. The right to rule belonged to a single bloodline chosen by the gods. The golden plough and yoke symbolized agriculture and the taming of the land. The battle axe represented military power. The drinking cup stood for ritual and hospitality. Together, they formed a complete picture of what a king should provide: sustenance, protection, and connection to the divine. Later Scythian rulers guarded these objects jealously. They were kept in a sacred precinct, and each year elaborate ceremonies were held to honor them. If the guardian priest fell asleep during the festival, the legend said he would die within a year. That detail reveals how seriously the Scythians took their myth. The golden relics were not just historical heirlooms, they were living proof that heaven had chosen their kings. About 2,500 years ago, Greek colonists along the Black Sea coast heard this story and recorded it. Herodotus, who traveled through the region, wrote it down with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. He noted that the Scythians also claimed their royal dead were buried in vast kurgans, mounds of earth that rose from the steppe like frozen waves. In those tombs, archaeologists have indeed found golden ornaments, weapons, and drinking vessels echoing the legendary objects. The myth and the material culture blended together, making it impossible to separate story from history. Even as Scythian power faded, conquered by the Sarmatians and later by the Goths, the memory of Tarjetaus persisted. It resurfaced in the folklore of later steppe peoples, adapted and renamed, but still carrying the same core idea: a king chosen by a falling gift from the sky. That same pattern, a sacred object descending from heaven to legitimize a ruler, would soon appear in a very different landscape where incense and spices replaced grass and horses, and where a queen would claim her authority from a meteorite that crashed into the desert sands. A single meteorite falling in the desert could birth a legend of a queen who was more than mortal. The Queen of Sheba appears in the pages of the Bible, the Quran, and the Ethiopian sacred texts, but her story shifts with every telling. In the Book of Kings, she is a wealthy and powerful ruler who travels to Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom with hard questions. She arrives with a caravan of camels carrying spices, gold, and precious stones. Solomon answers every riddle she poses, and she is so impressed that she blesses him and gives him a fortune in gifts. The Bible never names her, but it leaves no doubt about her wealth and influence. Jewish tradition later expanded that brief account. The rabbis speculated that she was not just a human queen but a creature of the spirit world, a jinn, a being of fire and air. They described her as having one human foot and one hoof, a detail that marked her as otherworldly. That image stuck. It suggested that her power came from a source beyond ordinary human lineage. In Islamic tradition, she is known as Bilqis. The Quran tells a different version. Solomon hears of a powerful queen in the land of Sheba who worships the sun. He sends a message demanding her submission. She consults her advisors, then sends him a gift testing his intentions. Solomon responds by transforming her throne before she arrives, a miracle that proves his prophethood. She recognizes the truth and declares her faith in the one God. But again, the story hints at something uncanny about her. Some commentators described her as half human and half jinn, a being who inherited intelligence and majesty from a supernatural parent. That ambiguity made her a figure of fascination. She was a queen, but she was also a bridge between worlds. The most elaborate version comes from Ethiopia. There, the story of the Queen of Sheba is preserved in the Kebra Nagast, the same text that traced the Solomonic dynasty. After her visit to Jerusalem, she returned to her homeland pregnant with Solomon's child. She gave birth to a son named Menelik, who later traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. When he returned, he brought with him the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest that contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments. This tradition made the Queen of Sheba not just a curious visitor but a direct ancestor of the Ethiopian imperial line. She became a mother of a dynasty that claimed divine origin. Her wisdom and wealth were no longer just personal attributes. They were proof that God had chosen her line to carry the most sacred object in the world. Over time, her story absorbed elements from local goddess cults. In some renderings, she was associated with the sun, with fertility, and with the mountains of the Horn of Africa. She became a symbol of female authority that was both spiritual and political. Her name echoed through centuries, even when the historical details faded. What remains is the portrait of a queen whose divine aura was constructed from fragments of scripture, folklore, and royal ambition. She was wise, wealthy, and mysterious enough to be shaped by each culture that retold her story. That same mystery would soon be embodied by a warrior empress on the other side of the world, a woman who took the throne of Japan not through marriage but through the strength of her own legend. The legend of Empress Jingū begins where most stories of divine rulers do not, with a woman who was already carrying a future emperor. When her husband, Emperor Chuai, passed away during a military campaign, Jingū did not retreat into mourning. She received a divine oracle from the gods, instructing her to complete the conquest that her husband had begun. The oracle came through the voice of a priest, but it was clear that the message was meant for her alone. She was to lead an invasion across the sea to the land of Silla in what is now Korea. This was not a role that any woman of her time would have been expected to fill. Yet the chronicles describe her as accepting the mission without hesitation, driven by a power that came from beyond the human world. The first obstacle was the sea itself. According to the ancient texts, the gods gave Jingū a magical stone, a tide stone that could control the ocean. When she threw the stone into the water, the waves rose in her favor, and the current carried her fleet directly toward the enemy coast. The ships sailed as if guided by an invisible hand, and the warriors aboard felt no fear. They believed that the Empress was not merely human, that she was a vessel for the will of heaven. The invasion itself was swift and decisive. Jingū's forces overwhelmed the kingdoms of the Korean peninsula, and the local rulers submitted without a prolonged struggle. The Nihon Shoki records that the king of Silla surrendered and swore an oath of loyalty, promising to send tribute to Japan forever. This conquest was not presented as a simple raid. It was portrayed as a divine mandate, a mission ordained by the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. The tribute that flowed from Korea for centuries after was used as proof that the gods had chosen Japan to rule over its neighbors. What makes this story even more remarkable is that throughout the entire campaign, Jingū was pregnant. She carried the future Emperor Ojin in her womb, and she gave birth only after returning to Japan. This detail is crucial. It meant that the invasion was led by a woman who was not only a ruler but also a mother-in-waiting, a symbol of life and continuation. The child she bore would later be celebrated as a great emperor, and his triumphs were seen as a continuation of his mother's divine favor. After her passing, Jingū was not forgotten. She was enshrined in Shinto tradition as a protector of the nation. Several shrines, most notably the Jingū-ji complex and the Hachiman shrines that later became associated with the god of war, trace their origins to her legacy. She is honored as a figure who could speak directly to the kami, the spirits of nature and ancestors. This shamanic role was not unusual for women in ancient Japanese society, where female rulers and priestesses often mediated between the human and the divine. But in Jingū's case, the shamanic power was fused with military command, a combination that made her unique. Her legend was later used for political purposes. During the Meiji period and the expansionist era of the early 20th century, Jingū's invasion of Korea was cited as historical justification for Japanese territorial claims. School textbooks presented her as a warrior empress who had established Japan's rightful influence over the peninsula. This reinterpretation of her story turned a semi-divine myth into a tool of modern nationalism. Scholars note that the historical evidence for such an invasion is thin. The Korean records do not mention it, and the dates in the Japanese chronicles are unreliable. Yet the myth persisted because it served a powerful need. It gave Japan a sacred origin story for its foreign policy, a precedent that seemed to come from the gods themselves. Jingū's divine status stands in contrast to most historical female rulers. In other cultures, women who led armies or claimed thrones were often seen as exceptions, anomalies that required special justification. Cleopatra used her lineage and alliance with Rome. The Empress Wu of China built her power through bureaucracy and patronage, but Jingū's authority was claimed directly from the heavens. She did not need to argue that she was fit to rule. The gods had chosen her, and that was enough. Her story is the 30th and last of these ancient legends, a fitting conclusion to a journey that began with Gilgamesh and the first dreams of divine kingship. Each legend carried a different shade of the same core belief, that some rulers were not ordinary, that their power came from a source beyond human reach. Now, after traveling across continents and centuries, it is time to ask what these stories mean for us today. Across 30 legends, one pattern holds steady: the human longing to see the divine in leadership. Whether a king climbed a mountain to receive a linga, a queen sailed with a tide stone, or a prince walked away from a palace to find truth, each story used the same invisible thread to stitch heaven to earth. Divine births, omens in the sky, sacred objects falling from above, rituals that renewed the ruler's soul, these were not just decorations, they were the architecture of authority. They answered a question that every society faces: who gets to rule and why should anyone obey? The answer, repeated in different languages and landscapes, was always the same. The ruler is chosen, the ruler is set apart, the ruler carries a power that no human hand can give or take away. These legends served two masters at once. They were political tools, yes, cementing dynasties and silencing rivals, but they were also spiritual anchors, giving people a way to understand chaos, misfortune, and the vastness of the world. When a pharaoh fought a battle, it was not just a skirmish over land, it was a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. When a Scythian king held the golden plow, he was not just a farmer. He was a living link to the sky. The stories made the immense universe feel manageable, and they made the ruler responsible for its balance, and those stories did not vanish. They echo in modern ceremonies, in the way we crown leaders, unveil monuments, and speak of presidents as if they carry a weight beyond the ordinary. The vocabulary has changed, but the shape remains. A head of state stands before a crowd, hand on a sacred text, swearing an oath before a watching nation. The cameras capture the moment, and we feel, however faintly, that something more than politics is happening. That is the ghost of divine kingship still flickering in the attic of our imagination. What can we take from these 30 ancient voices? Perhaps a reminder that power, at its root, is a story. The strongest armies and richest treasuries could not protect a ruler who lost the narrative. The stories had to be believed, nurtured, and retold. They had to be carved in stone, sung at festivals, and whispered to children. And when they stopped being believed, the kingdoms crumbled, not from invasion, but from the hollowing out of meaning. You do not need to travel to a temple or read a crumbling scroll to feel the pull of these legends. They are already part of how we think about leadership, sacrifice, and destiny. But if you want to go deeper, the primary sources are still there. The Epic of Gilgamesh waits on clay tablets. The Khmer Nagast lives in translation. The Nihon Shoki records the deeds of Jingū and Jimmu. The terraces of Angkor rise from the Cambodian jungle. Each one is a doorway into a world where the line between mortal and divine was thin enough to step across. If any of these stories stirred something in you, if you felt a spark of recognition or wonder, then the legends have done their work. They have reached across centuries and touched a living mind. That is the only immortality a ruler ever really had. Thank you for walking this path. If you enjoyed the journey, please like this video, subscribe for more explorations into the stories that shaped us, and share your own favorite legend of divine kingship in the comments. The thread continues as long as we keep telling the tale.